I want to start just by asking about your own path into the work of Islam and AI.
Wow.
There is no pipeline for this work, as you know, right? There's no certification you could get. How did you find yourself at this intersection?
Yeah, so back in the previous century, I did my PhD in AI, and I finished my PhD in 2000. And the joke at the time was people were telling me I was wasting my time and that there were no commercial applications for AI work. And then I went through a career where I worked through, first I was an academic, and then I worked at companies like Google and Uber and Canva. But all through that, I was developing my Islamic understanding through studying with Muslim scholars for a significant amount of time. And then I still remember when ChatGPT came out. Like, obviously, I'd been tracking AI. I was actually working at an AI company at the time called Anyscale. And I was like, let me just investigate how this could be used Islamically, or, what the things like bias and so on were. And very quickly, I kind of realized that there was potential here, risk and potential. And so I built a system called Ansari, which it's an Islamic AI assistant. And
Can you say what the significance of that word is?
Ansari is, within Islamic history, there was a period when the Prophet Muhammad had to leave his hometown of Mecca and go to another place because his own people were rejecting him. And that place became Medina, the modern city of Medina. And what the Prophet ﷺ did to help increase the bonds with the followers that were coming with him, about 100 followers followed him from Mecca to Medina, was create a sense of kinship or helping. And the Arabic word Ansari means to help someone. And so the idea was I didn't want to create a status of like, this is not a Muslim sheikh. It's not a replacement for a scholar. It's just something that's there to help you. And so the Ansar was the name given to the people from Medina who tried to help the people from Mecca with their daily life as they adjusted to a completely new environment and a new civilization. And that was a rough transition for the people from Mecca. The weather was completely different. Many of them got very sick. But the idea there is it's some kind of helper. And that's all it's intended to do. It's not meant to replace your scholar or anyone like that. And so that was the genesis of the name. But Ansari started like very early, like early 2023 was when we released the first version of Ansari. And that was very simple. But the idea is that, after that, I started to get involved in the Muslim community. The Muslim community started to ask me questions about AI. I was asked to present a workshop to imams at the Assembly of Muslim Jurists of America. And that workshop was very popular. 60 imams attended it, trying to understand what the implications of AI were for them. And since then, it's just been a way that I've found to help my community. It's an area where I have some expertise, and it feels like the community, the Muslim community, and the global spiritual community, I have something to contribute there. So that's how I got engaged and involved in all of this.
So I heard you recently on a different podcast, and I heard you describe AI as a potential fitna. Can you explain what that word means and how you're using it within the context of AI?
Yeah. So I mean, it's a really interesting question, and I think it comes from the Muslim worldview. The Muslim worldview is that life is a test, that we are here to be tested in a way, to see if we can ascend and perfect ourselves and become better human beings, or we just revert to our base instincts, that idea of choice. And the idea of this life is in many ways it's a test. And really, that's the way I see AI, is that it's a test, not just for individuals, although there is an individual aspect to the test of AI. It's a test for humanity to see we are being given this gift of AI, this responsibility for AI. Another key Islamic concept is this idea that humanity has amana. We were entrusted with the stewardship of the world. And AI is another part of that stewardship. It has the potential to elevate humanity, and it has the potential to damage us. Like, when I think about the economic impact of AI, some estimates put it that AI will contribute $16 trillion to the world economy by 2030. I think that's PricewaterhouseCoopers. Now, $16 trillion is a lot of money. That's $2,000 for every living human. How much good could you do with that, right? But we as a society, as humanity, have to navigate the distributional questions of the surplus that AI will create. Will we use it to mint the first trillionaires? And if you look at the people in the world who are on that list who could become the world's first trillionaires, all of them are involved in AI. Elon Musk, obviously, with his work there, but also people like Sergey Brin and Larry Page. So that surplus from AI could make our first trillionaires, or we could use it to make a massive impact on problems like poverty. And so that's the type of test that we're facing. And then as individuals, do we use AI to elevate ourselves, to use it to benefit humanity, to take care of ourselves and help improve our growth and development? Or do we use it for our base instincts and for purposes that are not so great, whether it's just entertainment or for polarizing society or for greedy self-focused needs or our material needs? And that's what I mean by it's a test. It's literally which way are we going to go, both as individuals, but also as humanity. And that will determine whether AI is a benefit or a harm. It has so much potential. AI is just the ultimate dual-use technology. It's like intelligence itself, right?
We're at a funny place when it comes to religious responses to AI, where there are some communities that have very well-developed responses, right? Putting out an encyclical that is the length of a book is a real project that requires a huge team and a lot of organized effort. The Mormon response is also very well-developed. How do you see the Islamic response in terms of its development? Where is it doing well? Where is it still in its early stages?
I wouldn't say we're as far advanced as, say, the Catholic response or the Mormon response. And one reason for that is understanding that Islam is a very decentralized faith. For the mainstream Sunni version of Islam that 85% plus of Muslims adhere to, there's no one kind of bastion. There's no pope for those 85%, those 1 billion plus Muslims, right? And so it's a much more communal process of building the law where there are centers of power, centers of influence. But there's no one person who can say, thou shalt or thou shalt not in the same way that the pope can, and who organizes a massive organization that dwarfs some nation states in terms of its spread, right? The Muslim response will be a little bit more decentralized. I was just looking at the statistics recently, and the United Arab Emirates has one of the highest adoption rates of AI of any nation, which might be a surprise to people, where the stereotype of Islam is kind of almost as a technologically backward religion, which, of course, I obviously don't feel is correct. But I think we are seeing a lot of adoption of AI. The Muslim community response to it is cautious, I would say, and we're still trying to work it out. I'd say there are two currents, especially when it comes to its use in worldly applications. There's general wide acceptance that this is the reality we live with and you can't really do a lot with it, and that there are benefits to be had there. But its particular application in religion, that's where there's kind of a lot of discussion. And I mentioned earlier, the Assembly of Muslim Jurists of America. Their conference this year, a lot of the focus will be on that question of exactly how do we approach the question of religion in Islam.
Yeah, so can you give a sense of the kinds of questions that are on the agenda?
So I think there's the first family is the question about using AI in Islam itself. If you're preparing a sermon or something, if you're a layperson and you're trying to get an answer, is it acceptable to use AI? What are the risks of that? Especially given that AI has certain properties. First of all, we don't understand what the models are doing, right? This idea that we have a full understanding of what 500 billion parameters are doing and what's in those 500 billion parameters, unfortunately, that we don't. And it's a field of investigation that researchers are trying to understand exactly what it is that these models are learning. Then the existing problems of hallucination, where the AIs can make up things, and that's not an area. So on the other hand, you have the challenge of, well, this is a very useful practical tool. If you wake up at 3 a.m. and have a question of faith, having that immediate access is also impactful.
What's your read of this? How are imams thinking about this right now in terms of their comfortability or fear of using AI for sermons?
Well, if no one is kind of, type in a prompt, get a khutbah. No one's doing that, right? The respect that Muslims show for their sources in terms of the holy text, the Quran, and the narrations of what the Prophet of Islam did, the hadith, is too high for us to trust that completely to an AI, which still, even with the best systems available that use source checking and citation checking, isn't quite there. But there's some people who are I don't want AI to touch my khutbahs. That's between me and God, and I will do everything more or less manually in terms of the drafting of that. To other people who are well, no, there's an opportunity for me to elevate the khutbah by using AI to find stories from our tradition that align better with the points that I'm trying to make, that allow me to tailor it to the particular audience that I'm talking to. And so there's kind of this spectrum of not use it altogether. And, I've got the chance to review some of the papers that we're starting to see, and other people that are more open to using it as part of a process. And all of these systems, Ansari can be used to prepare sermons. And I do see a peak on Thursday evenings, just as people are trying to work out the sermon. Because, again, Islam is kind of a decentralized religion. So many of the people who give sermons are like lay people where there's a high school and there's like 15 students they have to give a sermon to. And so you can see the utility that's coming from people being able to use AI to craft a sermon that is probably higher quality than what they would be able to do given the time that they had available. But the scholarly folks, I think, are a little bit more selective. Again, this is what I mean. AI is a fitna, it's a test, right? Given the tool of AI, do you use it to knock out a khutbah in 15 minutes, knock out a sermon in 15 minutes? Or do you use AI to kind of elevate the quality of the sermon and take the time it usually would, but just make it better, refine the text and so on, right? And so when I say AI is a test, I mean, it's a test for us on a moment-by-moment basis. And it's really interesting to see the research that's happening now about how AI, if not used carefully, leads to a certain level of cognitive laziness. Our brain actually uses a lot of calories to do what it does. And given the opportunity, it will be lazy in its thinking, just like it would be lazy in everything else, because that's, calorically conservative. But that's a temptation you have to resist. It's an example of how on a moment-by-moment basis, AI is a test for our identity and what we hold important.
So what else is on the agenda for the Muslim community?
I mean, it's also things like Muslims working in tech, right? Like there's a lot of Muslims, if you live here in Silicon Valley, some 5 to 10%, what are the ethics of working for a company that is building this technology? Also about the social implications, right? Like the AI is going to be leading to not necessarily unemployment as a system as a whole, but a lot of transitions in people's employments. What are the questions around that? Have those people that was used to train the data that was used to train these models, is it sourced correctly? Were they compensated correctly? What happens if AI makes a mistake? And who's liable for that? Is it the company that makes it available? Is it the software developer? And how do we answer that distributional question? Are there things we can do to kind of ensure that the surplus that comes from AI is more evenly distributed? And what directions can we give in terms of activism, in terms of how the Muslim community engages in the dialogue that's going to happen as society navigates this massive transition that's to come?
Amazing. So I want to ask a question that itself is a kind of oversimplification. When I see that different religious communities have different kind of instincts when it comes to where the answers are going to come from about responses to AI. So I've seen in Christian communities, there's often an instinct towards theology, thinking about AI as part of or not part of a human-divine relationship and connected to humanity's particular importance or status. Within Judaism, there is often an instinct towards law, trying to use legal sources and ask legal questions. What are the sources that are kind of instinctively used within Islamic context to try to grapple with AI?
I think the framework that we've been touching on, this idea that it's a test, is kind of part of that framing, that AI is something given by a gift to us from God, and we're being tested in the way that we use that. And so really the question is, how do we respond to that in a structured way? And so I'd say it's somewhere in the middle between those two extremes, in the sense of you have that theological basis that comes from this understanding that humanity is entrusted with responsibility, that we have a responsibility of stewardship, and that this new thing has arrived. And so what are the ways that we can ensure that this new arrival benefits humanity and doesn't harm humanity? And Islam is very rich in the equipment set that it has for that. And something that you're familiar with, given your background, which is, concepts like the intentions or the goals of the Sharia, what are called maqasid, in terms of preservation of faith, preservation of life, all the way down to preservation of wealth at the bottom, and kind of this priority list of like what the purpose of things are. And so I think what it's trying to do is connect the spiritual aspect, that we have this responsibility, that life is a test, and that we have to ensure that, what happens with this technology benefits humanity and allows humanities to focus on our higher aspirations instead of being called to our baser needs. And that the law and whatever laws we come up with, and Islam has a good toolkit in that regards, aligns the world in such a way that we can focus on those spiritual questions. But it's much more means-oriented. I mean, I know that there is some scholarship around like, is AI sentient? But that's almost bypassed in the Islamic faith because it doesn't affect what we as humans would do with it. And there's not a single scholar I've known that has judged that AI as it currently stands is a moral agent, that it's mukallaf, right? This concept of one day, all of us are going to stand before God and be held to account for what we've done. Nobody really believes within the Muslim community that AI is mukallaf. It's not accountable in the same way. So regardless of the status of AI, our responsibility doesn't really change. And so it doesn't focus on many of the philosophical questions in the same way that, say, a Christian theologian might. And of course, all of these traditions are very broad, right? But, in general, what you'll find with Islam is that it tries to take the spiritual aspect and not lose that connection, but connect that spiritual aspect with the law aspect. Like the law is in service of the spirit. And Islam has a very strong tradition of connecting those two things together. So it's not kind of this dualist perspective of, spirit or law. How can we have a consistent and connected conversation between those two things that orbits around the question of what is the benefit for humanity? Does this allow the world to become a more spiritually driven place, a more divinely aligned place than where it currently is?
I love that answer. I want to ask you about authority. So Islam, I think even more than Judaism, has a really strong respect for not just the ideas themselves, but also the sources of the ideas, their provenance. So, if you read hadith, right, like any hadith will begin with not just like Muhammad said this, but like here's like the long list of people who transmitted it from Muhammad. And then there's supplementary books that will tell you like, and here's who that person is. And that's why we trust them. And here's, it matters that we know this tradition from like 5 sources or only 3 sources, and it matters that they're similar or different, right? Like there's like a kind of scientific level of veracity that the things that are being transmitted are truly authentic. One thing that AI does is it obscures sources of transmission. It's like the information itself might be good, but it jumbles the pathway by which it got to that idea. So how do you think about that, especially within the context of a Muslim who is asking a faith-based question from an AI system?
I have this adage that the solution to most problems caused by AI is more AI. So if you look at Ansari, which is the system that I've built that we were talking about earlier, it focuses a lot on those very sources. We use a system called retrieval augmented generation. So say you ask a question like, how does Islam approach the question of just war theory or something like that, right? The first thing that Ansari does before it even tries to answer the question is looks up Quran, which is, the holy book of the Muslims, looks up hadith for all of those quotations, those sources with those strong chains. And I mean, the level of intricateness in hadith analysis is very high. So those books that say who narrated this story, there's an entire field called ilm al-rijal, the knowledge of narrators, where literally you can ask, where was this person? When did he die? When was he born? Did these two people even meet together to have that conversation? And so what you can do is you can use techniques like before answering a question, pull all of the sources in and not even asking the AI to do anything until it's pulled those sources, and then saying within the context of these resources, how do you answer? Asking the AI to give citations for everything. And one of the notable things about Ansari that was new at the time, unfortunately has become more established, was its emphasis on citations for every statement. Now, it's not perfect because the AIs kind of can implicitly extract implicit information from those sources. But by constraining the AI, we can ensure that, and that's one of the things that I try to teach people in my courses and so on, is like, don't just ask ChatGPT or whatever. You have to give it, firstly, an Islamic framing so it knows the worldview that you're bringing to it. And secondly, tell it the sources to pull from. And so Ansari is also available as a skill, for example, so that, if you're using Claude or something like that, you can actually teach Claude to use Ansari to pull those citations in. And so it's very much at the heart of it. And I'd say it's one of the distinctive things about Islam is its emphasis on the sources and just historically where Islam came. It came at a time where writing was established. And, it being the youngest of the 3 monotheistic religions at, 1400 years old, right? And it was also something, we don't think of it, but writing itself is a technology. In fact, one interesting observation is that you can think of writing as going through 3 evolutions. The first one is from an Islamic perspective. The Prophet's adoption of writing is part of our Islamic tradition. He encouraged people to learn how to read. There are requirements in the Islamic faith that certain things like contracts be written down. There was an adoption that was radical at the time that it took kind of other religions a while to catch up, which is the centralization of writing in the faith. The second evolution was the printing press, in which writing became much more widespread and reading across the entire globe became much more of a thing, and writing becoming a medium of communication much more broadly with lay people was the second evolution. The Muslim community didn't handle that one so well. But AI is kind of the third evolution of that writing process. And when you talk to experts in the field, they tell you, talk to some of the folks at Anthropic, and they will tell you that Claude is made of writing. So there's this kind of idea of an evolution of the forms that writing takes. But, I think one of the beauties of that particular approach is just the centrality of sources. It's implicit, and you have to kind of push the AIs to make it explicit, but it can be done. And that's why I tell people to not just use ChatGPT blindly. And there are benchmarks that we run to make sure that, these systems don't hallucinate. And I've seen some heinous hallucinations. There was, when Muslims prepare for prayer, they wash different parts of their body. And someone asked, do you need to wash your knees as part of that process? And as recently as a year ago, ChatGPT would say, yes, you do. And no scholar in the history of Islam would ever say that that's something. So hallucination is a problem. It can be mitigated by putting the right safeguards and emphasis on sources in place. And that's, really a key part of what's distinguishing AI for Muslims from other types of AI, is that emphasis. I mean, it's useful to everybody, but it's particularly important for Muslims in matters of faith.
What I found impressive is that not only are you thinking through how to provide these answers through LLMs and through these RAGs, but also are developing benchmarks, are thinking about how do you ensure quantitatively that the responses are accurate. So can you talk a little bit about the benchmarks that are developing? Because I have not, there are like within Judaism, similar kinds of products around providing halachic responses, Jewish legal responses to various questions. I have not seen any attempts to determine which systems are better or worse, more or less accurate. So can you talk about those benchmarks?
I mean, AI is moving incredibly fast. So what I'm talking about is literally stuff that's been happening in the last few months and weeks. But it's really exciting. When we've had benchmarks for a while, but they tended to be simple and small. Now, in the last few months, there's two, Islamic MLU and Islamic Legal Bench. And both of those are focused on the correctness of the rulings on Islamic teachings, because again, we have a very extensive literature formed over millennia, and the Muslim community was a large community globally that needed law within that framework. The Muslim empires kind of petered out through the last 2 or 3 centuries, but it was a huge empire where law was required. And so these new systems measure things like the accuracy of the answers, the tendency of these systems to hallucinate sources, which we were talking about earlier. But they're still very new. And one thing I would also emphasize is they are focused on the fiqh aspects, legal aspects, what's allowed, what's not allowed, how do you pray, all of that kind of stuff. I'm really interested in the values aspects. And this is actually an area where I'm actively collaborating with people from other faith groups. I'm probably going to interview Tim Huang, I'm sure at some future point, who has an organization around Christian machine intelligence. And him and I would literally having a discussion about this morning about how we have benchmarks for values. Does this AI have a positive impact on this person's behavior? And so it's a very active field. The focus so far has been on the legal aspects, but I'm really excited about the values aspects. And that's something that all faith groups are navigating right now. And while the exact values may be different, there are certain universals that cut across all religions. We all care about this idea of community, of transcendence. And so these problems that we're facing in the Muslim community, the legal one is more Muslim focused, but the question of values in AI, I think, is more universal than just the Islamic one. And it's really interesting to see the developments of, in the case of Tim, Virtue Bench, which is literally a benchmark of virtue.
So just to bring some numbers into this for a second, right now Ansari, I believe, is on the top of the leaderboards for responses to Islamic legal questions, like at 95% accuracy or something like that?
There's lots of measures, but the Islamic MMLU, I think it's at about 94.2%, and it's the top one currently. But that's going to shift around a lot. And the great thing is that even the AI's level of hallucination that I was talking about a year ago, that's come down way. And even if you don't Islamify the AIs, many of them will perform pretty well on Islamic questions now around legal questions. And they won't make stupid mistakes like the ones that they were doing before. Yeah. So I had a benchmark called Batik. And 2 years ago, I'd be lucky, the first versions of GPT would get 80%. And now almost all the models are maxing it out. They've saturated my benchmark and they all get 100%. So the difference has moved on to questions like, what are your sources? Are you citing real sources? One of ChatGPT's problems, for example, is it will give you the correct hadith, but it will hallucinate the source for it. And then you go and look it up in a book and it doesn't exist. But the hadith itself exists. The text of the hadith exists, but the citation was hallucinated.
Right. That's what I mean about a change of tradition. Okay, so I have a devious thought for you. Because now that these benchmarks exist, I was thinking a few weeks ago, one of the ways to become a rabbi is there is an official set of exams that you can take in Israel. And if you pass a certain number of those exams, then, you can be certified by the rabbi. There's lots of ways to become a rabbi, but that's one of the main ways. Women were recently allowed to start taking the test. And I've been thinking, what would happen if an AI was allowed to take those tests, and how would it do, and how well would it do relative to other students? And so now that you have these benchmarks, you can ask, well, how well does Ansari fare relative to, say, a mid-level jurist or to a Muslim high school student or something like that? And it invites these comparisons with actual human beings. So first of all, do you have numbers?
Yes, I do.
And how do you think about that?
So I haven't done this in a while, but about a year and a half ago, there's a seminary here in the US. And so I asked those folks for the exam for its Islamic 101 theology. And I had Ansari answer the questions, and it scored 80%, which was about average for a normal student. So I haven't really pushed it. But again, there's being able to pass the tests, and there's being an imam, which is the Islamic equivalent of a rabbi. And those two things are not the same because, especially in Islam, there's a concept of understanding the person who's talking to you and reading the context. So could it meet the technical criteria for being a rabbi or an imam? Yes. Does it make it an imam? No, right? And because is the AI accountable is a very important question, right? And there's this idea in Islam of, if you ask an imam a question, that person is held accountable for the answer that they give. And they might get it wrong, but what matters is the sincerity in the way that they gave it and the diligence that they showed, right? So that's part one. And then number two is the question of reading the person in front of you, understanding the situation, right? So there's lots of stories in Islam where, an old man comes and asks a question and a young man comes and asks a question to the same imam in the same gathering, and the imam gives different answers based on who the person asking the question is, right? That's something that AI can't do, right? That understanding of who's the person that's talking to them, what's the best way to communicate with them. And so I don't think there's a goal to replace imams, and I don't think that's even something that makes sense because of that concept of accountability is so absent with AI.
Right.
But could it be as knowledgeable as a human? Yes. Could it make less mistakes than a human? Possibly. Does that make it a religious leader in the sense that the Muslim community needs? No.
Yeah.
Imagine you made a fresh graduate from an Islamic seminary available to every person in the United States. That, we have a problem with religious scholarship in the Muslim community in that there's not enough imams around, right? Can AI kind of fill the gap and help answer people's questions, help them with, whenever they have those questions and need someone to navigate them? That's the question that's the one that kind of keeps me up at night because I can see the benefit. Everything comes back to benefits and harms in the Islamic framework of making that information available. But I can also see the risk in cutting off a potential human relationship that could have been richer because you got a good enough answer from the AI, right? And that's kind of the dilemma that I live with. And sorry, it comes with pluses and minuses, and I'm not always comfortable with the minuses. But I like to think that the benefits of it exceed the harms. I will be held accountable for that. But hopefully it'll be a plus and not a negative.
Yeah. In Judaism, there's like a longstanding anxiety about divorcing texts from rabbis, divorcing texts from authorities out of a sense of the ways that they will be read. And there's actually a story in the Talmud about a certain rabbi, Rabbi Meir, who is acknowledged from a technical perspective to be like the best of his generation. And he was so good that, for any question you asked him, he could answer 49 ways in one direction and 49 ways in the other direction, which like is a nice party trick, but it doesn't actually get to the question of what is just or what is right. And because of that, the rabbis actually don't follow him. Just because he's the best, but because he doesn't really have the correct orientation towards the truth.
Yeah.
You've mentioned the printing press a couple times and Islam's history with science and technology.
Yeah.
Right. So there's like this long period that used to be called the Dark Ages, where people were like, oh, science has been lost. And then the West rediscovered it. I wonder how that happened.
Yes.
And there has been a decades-long attempt to correct that, to understand that actually Islam is doing a huge amount of intentionally translating and synthesizing both work that is coming from places like India and also from the Roman Empire, from Greece, from all kinds of different sources, and is developing it, is improving in things like astronomy, giving mathematical rigor to astronomical models, developing mechanics, things like that. And at the same time, there is a kind of drop-off, especially in the early modern period after Columbus reaches the New World, where there is a growing disparity between the way that technology is used within Christian context and with Islamic context. It may be perhaps I don't know, this is the best example, but it's a notable example of how the Quran, I think it's printed in Italy already in the 1500s or so, but the first time that the Quran is printed by Muslims is not until the late 18th the early 19th century. And so there is a kind of gap there. So how does the memory of that history, or the memory of a kind of a history of lagging behind, how does that affect the Muslim approach to AI right now?
Yeah. I mean, personally, when I talk to Muslims, I use it as a counterexample, right? Like, because again, it was about 6 centuries ago, but it really marked the beginning of the ascendance of Europe and the kind of decline of the Muslim community. And that took 300, 400 years to kind of play itself out for various reasons. And it wasn't that they were banned. It was just that there were, ironically, many shadows of what we see today, right? People were concerned about the employment impacts on the scholar class, the scribe class that would write these texts manually. There was concern about things like, this is a holy text. How can you leave it to a machine to print? And there was also kind of practical questions like, hey, Arabic has, connected ligatures. It needs 150 pieces of lead to kind of represent it instead of 25 or whatever. And I mean, I think the other thing to realize is that Europe did not make that transition easily. There were 130 years of wars and so on that followed the creation of the printing press. And so what I like to do is to look at it as a historical analog. And I think it's, again, there's these connections in terms of both of them being connected with writing. There's the Islamic connection with writing from our very beginning. The first words revealed in the Quran were an incitement to read and recite. And so there's those connections. And what I say is like AI, again, is the challenge that we're facing as a Muslim community. And if we don't play our cards right, it could either be a chance for the Muslim community to strengthen and grow, or it could be another step in the decline of the Muslim community. And that's part of my personal advocacy, that what I'm trying to do is encourage the Muslim community to embrace AI with wisdom and in a wise and thoughtful way. And that historically in the last, say, century hasn't always been the case. I think there's a tendency as new technologies come, if you look at the last 50 years, things like television, satellite TV, internet, social media, that the Muslim community original reaction is to kind of resist, because in many cases, these technologies were not value-free. They came with Western values, right? With satellite TV came Western satellite TV shows, and those had values that were not consistent with Islam. We resist it for a long time, and then we embrace it wholeheartedly, right? So now the amount of satellite TV that covers Islamic topics is very large. Social media is another example, right, where originally there was resistance to it because, again, a lot of the applications of social media were not aligned with Islamic moral values. It was frequently used for deception and boastfulness and so on, and inappropriate content. And so there was a resistance to it. But eventually the Muslim community fully embraced the social medium. So I think one of the things that the Muslim community is facing is, if AI is a different technology, and I'll talk about why in a moment. If we can't afford to have that type of delay that we had in the adoption of those other technologies, because when we do that, we don't get a say in how the technology is built. Social media was built in a particular way, and there was the opportunity to direct it in a more positive way, but we were too busy condemning it to direct it in a positive way. And I think that's something that we can't afford to do with, this is my personal opinion, we can't afford to do with AI. The way I describe it is that AI is a train that's coming. It can't really be stopped. And putting yourself in front of the tracks is not a productive thing to do. The best thing to do is to hop on the train and try to steer it, till it gets to a destination that is more aligned with Islamic values. And I think the story of social media and what happened there is kind of a reminder to Muslims that these things can have a real world impact on the Muslim community.
So I want to take us to a different place. Within the Jewish context, one of the things that has defined the Jewish approach to AI has been the wars in Gaza and in Iran, both because it has consumed a lot of the total intellectual energy of the Jewish people, but also because these are wars that have made extensive use of AI. And that's meant that discussing AI from a policy perspective, especially AI for military applications, is not some abstract idea. It actually has direct ramifications and implications for the ways that these wars are being conducted. And I imagine that there is a similar effect on the Islamic approach to AI. And I'm curious what you've seen about how those wars have affected the Islamic approach.
It's a complex relationship. Unfortunately, in both of those situations, it's kind of Muslims who are at the receiving end, if you know what I mean, right? And that's made it hard. And when you look at some of the uses of AI, they haven't been used in the best way, right? So the way that the Israeli military is choosing who to target, the way that they were using AI, that literally there was a knob that said, how many innocent civilians can you kill to hit one, quote, terrorist? And that sometimes that knob was turned as high as 10 or 20. And at the same time, what we know about that process was that the reviewers were somewhat blasé and falling into that cognitive laziness problem that we were talking about is a reason that Muslims are concerned. The situation that happened in Iran where, we're still trying to diagnose exactly what happened, but there's some evidence that poor decisions by AI led to the death of civilians, in one case, dozens of girls at a school, right? I think what that's done is sharpen to the Muslim community that AI is a real issue and that things like the lethal applications of AI are not a theoretical thing anymore. Essentially have been being used in Gaza for a while, and we saw it kind of reach a new pinnacle. I'm using the word pinnacle in a weird way, but reach a new pinnacle in the case of Iran in terms of how much AI was used there. So I think it's sharpening the Muslim response to realize that AI is going to affect people's lives, that AI is now making life and death decisions. It's the things that we talked about theoretically a long time ago are now becoming real. But I don't think that those concerns are exclusively Islamic. I've been involved in an organization called the Faith Family Technology Network, and they are just as concerned about the uses of AI for taking life as Muslims are. Because, there's this idea that if you allow automated processes that are not accountable or are only indirectly accountable to make decisions about who lives and dies, you are devaluing human life. That's not an exclusively Islamic perspective. And that's why, Muslims and Christians and many people of different faiths, even secular humanists, people who don't have a religious belief but believe in the sacredness of life, are banding together to prevent or try to campaign to advocate for limits on the way AI is used during war. Maybe what's happening in Gaza and Iran is happening to Muslims now, but it's going to be a universal problem. And unless there are safeguards, it may lead to more loss of human life because of AI, because of that indirectness. And so it's just sharpened the Muslim perspective, sharpened the need for Muslims to react in a way that maybe other communities have not had to face directly in the same way as the Muslim community has had to.
I guess this is connected to that question. You can create a kind of quadrant of religions when it comes to AI in terms of centralized and population, right? So like Catholicism is highly centralized and there's a lot of Catholics. Mormonism is highly centralized, but there aren't so many Mormons, right? Judaism is decentralized and there aren't so many Jews. Muslims, decentralized, lots of Muslims. And my question, because there are both a lot of Muslims and because it is decentralized, what does it mean to talk about a kind of global Muslim response to AI, right? Because you're talking about Muslims who are living in a place like America where they're a minority, Muslims who are living in countries where Islamic law has an impact on governance and everything in between. So do you detect kind of regional differences in the Islamic approach to AI? How much is it a global conversation? How much do you see them as being separate conversations?
I think what we've seen generally in the trend over the last half century is a trend towards globalization anyway. And ChatGPT is available to everyone on the globe. And there are users that, some of the countries with the highest usage are places like Indonesia, Pakistan, of ChatGPT. And you can look up the statistics. So AI itself is a global phenomenon. And there are also countries now, Muslim countries, that are building sovereign large language models because of the concern that Western developed large language models encode Western liberal values that may or may not be aligned with Muslim ones. So I see a global response, but the Muslim community also has other challenges in terms of, for example, poverty. What I see is everyone who cares about AI is pretty much aligned and the conversations are happening across English and Arabic, across different cultures. For Western society, maybe AI is in the top 3 problems society has to work through, right? For many Muslim countries, AI is not in the top 3. Getting food, having a safe environment where your house isn't being attacked or you're not in the middle of a civil war is probably higher priority. But again, the Muslim community is decentralized, and that means every Muslim community has different challenges, right? Muslims in China, in the Uyghur areas, are going to face different challenges from Muslims living in the Gulf, right? But by and large, the response has been less regional than you would expect because the impacts of AI are global. But it's just there's a difference about the priority that is being given to AI as the challenges face the Muslim community, right? Like we can't be talking about, how AI can benefit all of humanity when someone is starving or their basic needs are being met. It's just not on their priority list.
Okay, last question.
Cool.
Right now, we're in a place where the ideas being put forward by different faiths about AI are more or less the same, right? Everyone kind of wants similar things. But as religious responses to AI develop, you can imagine faiths pulling away from each other in terms of their particular concerns or ideologies. If you had to guess, right, looking forward, let's say 5 or 10 years from now, where do you imagine that the Islamic approach to AI will be most distinctive? Or how do you imagine it differing from other faith traditions or from secular responses to AI?
So first of all, I want to emphasize that, again, what I'm seeing is an evolving distinction into two groups, right? Like there are those that have some kind of idea of human transcendence and have some kind of idea of community. And that cuts across a lot of different religious groups and non-religious groups, right? And so what I'm seeing is an alliance forming on that side, versus on the other side is a concern for more material, secular materialist perspectives or unfettered capitalism or he who dies with the most toys wins type mentality. Those are the types of challenges. The group who just says we're just material beings, all that matters is what, is a very much hedonistic inward looking view. So that's the first division that I'm seeing. And so you're going to see a lot more alignment within the group of people who care about meaning and community than differences as we navigate that first kind of culture war between those two sides, right? And I'm not sure who's going to win that two culture wars. In terms of the distinctions as we get further on, again, I see much more alignment than disagreement, but I think there's going to be a lot more emphasis on veracity. And because of the importance of Islamic texts to the sources, that's going to be there. And the importance of sovereignty, of having control over these AI models, right? Like if you're a Christian, you're living in the United States, obviously the value systems that are implicitly encoded into the LLMs will be safeguarded, right? There's going to be some back and forth within the society. But what if we have a different value system as Muslims? How do we encode that? And how do you build models so that the LLMs don't become a tool of cultural imperialism, right? Is a question that the Muslim community is dealing with as kind of probably one of the largest groups that are kind of in the decentralized large model group, right? And yeah, again, just the emphasis on making sure that everything is cited properly, that the value systems that are aligned are really aligned around not just individual rights, but making sure that AI aligns with the community values and that the community is protected as well. And Muslim communities are tight-knit in many ways. If you live in a Muslim community where literally you pray 5 times a day and you go to the same mosque and you're seeing the same people, often 3 or 4 times a day, that's a very tight-knit community. That's something that's relatively distinctive versus other communities. And so that community aspect is very important in the Islamic faith. And so there's going to be a lot more thoughts about how do we protect the community from that level of deep engagement and ukhuwa or brotherhood or ummah, I think is going to be one of the challenges.
Right. Thank you so much. This is great.
Oh, thank you so much, DC. I'm a big fan of your work, love the podcast, and I'm just really grateful that I got the chance to talk to you about this.